June 4th, 1942, 10:22 a.m., 15,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky is about to die. He knows it. His bombardier knows it. The 32 pilots following him know it. Here's why. McClusky's Norden bombsight needs 3 full seconds to stabilize before he can drop his bomb accurately. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners below him need only 2 seconds to blow him out of the sky, 3 seconds to aim, 2 seconds to die. It's not a close call. It's not even a gamble. It's mathematics. Cold, brutal mathematics that 47 American pilots have already learned the hard way over the past 6 months. But McClusky isn't pulling out of his dive. He's not aborting. He's not even hesitating. Because 15,000 feet below him are 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These 4 ships carry the aircraft that bombed Pearl Harbor. They represent the entire striking power of the Japanese combined fleet. And McClusky has figured something out, something the Navy doesn't know, something the engineers who built the Norden bombsight never tested, something about those 3 seconds of hydraulic delay that every pilot has been taught to fear. He's about to prove that the fatal flaw in America's most sophisticated weapon is actually the reason America is going to win this battle. This is the story of 3 seconds that changed World War II, but to understand why McClusky is willing to bet his life and the entire Pacific War on a 3-second window, we need to go back. Not to the beginning of the battle, not even to Pearl Harbor. We need to go back to a laboratory in New York City, 1928, where an engineer named Carl Norden is about to create a machine that will kill thousands of men, including the men who use it. Carl Norden was a Dutch engineer who immigrated to America in 1904. He was a perfectionist, the kind of man who would spend 6 months adjusting a single gear ratio because it was almost right instead of exactly right. In 1928, the U.S. Navy hired Norden to solve a problem. How do you drop a bomb on a moving ship from a moving aircraft? This wasn't a new problem. Pilots had been trying to bomb ships since World War I. Their success rate was catastrophic. Less than 2% of bombs hit their targets. The problem was simple physics. A bomb dropped from a moving aircraft doesn't fall straight down. It follows a curved ballistic path affected by the aircraft's speed, altitude, wind, and the target's movement. Human pilots couldn't calculate this in real time. Not accurately. Not consistently. Norden's solution was the Mark 15th automatic bombsight, what we now call the Norden bombsight. Here's how it worked. At the heart of the Norden was a gyroscopically stabilized platform. This platform remained perfectly level regardless of the aircraft's movement. The bombardier would input the aircraft's altitude and airspeed, the estimated wind speed, and the target's course and speed. The bombsight's mechanical computer, a mechanical computer using gears and cams, would calculate the bomb's trajectory. But here's the genius part. The bombsight was linked directly to the aircraft's autopilot. Once the bombardier had the target in his crosshairs, the bombsight would actually fly the aircraft, making tiny adjustments to keep the bomb's projected path lined up with the target. When everything aligned, the bombsight would automatically release the bomb at the exact right moment. In testing, the Norden bombsight was devastatingly accurate. In 1931, during demonstration tests at Chesapeake Bay, bombardiers using the Norden put 5 consecutive bombs within a 75-foot circle from 20,000 feet. That's hitting a tennis court from 4 miles up, from a moving aircraft in wind. The Navy was ecstatic. They classified the Norden as top secret. They built a dedicated factory. They required pilots to swear an oath to destroy the bombsight rather than let it fall into enemy hands. They spent $8,000 per unit more than an average American house cost in 1940. By December 7, 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the Norden bombsight was installed in every American dive bomber and level bomber. It was America's secret weapon, the device that would win the war. There was just one problem. Carl Norden had never tested his bombsight against an enemy that was actively trying to kill the bombardier. And that brings us to a 19-year-old Japanese sailor named Tadashi Nakajima, who was about to learn something about the Norden bombsight that Carl Norden never intended. Tadashi Nakajima joined the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1938. By 1942, he was a gun captain on the aircraft carrier Akagi, the flagship of the fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor. Nakajima's weapon was the Type 96 25mm anti-aircraft gun. It was a simple weapon by 1942 standards. No radar, no computerized fire control, just optical sights, mechanical training gears, and human reflexes. But the Japanese Navy had developed a doctrine for using these simple weapons that was devastatingly effective. Here's how it worked. Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine was built around one principle: speed of engagement. Don't try to track the aircraft. Predict where it's going to be. When an American dive bomber began its attack run, it would typically dive at a 65 to 70 degree angle at speeds between 240 and 280 knots. These parameters were standard across the entire U.S. Navy. They were in the training manuals. They were predictable. Japanese gunners were trained to watch for the moment a dive bomber's nose dropped the start of the dive. At that instant, the gunner would calculate a firing solution based on standard American dive profiles. He would aim not at where the aircraft was, but at a point in space where the aircraft would be in 2.1 seconds. Then he would wait, perfectly still, gun aimed at empty sky. 2.1 seconds later, the American aircraft would fly directly into his line of fire. The Japanese called this technique leading the bird. They drilled it constantly. Gun crews competed on their timing precision. The best crews could engage targets within 1.8 seconds of spotting them. During the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, Japanese anti-aircraft gunners achieved something unprecedented. They shot down 43% of American dive bombers that executed standard attack profiles. 43%. American pilots called it the meat grinder. Diving on a Japanese carrier wasn't combat. It was suicide with extra steps. The Navy's response was to emphasize speed. The faster you dove, the less time Japanese gunners had to track you. The updated doctrine, issued after Coral Sea, was explicit: maximize dive speed, minimize time in target zone, accept reduced accuracy as necessary cost of survival. This is where the Norden bombsight's 3-second stabilization delay became a death sentence. You see, when a pilot pushed his dive bomber into a 70-degree dive at 250 knots, the G-forces would slam into the Norden's gyroscope. The hydraulic damping system would engage, controlling the gyroscope's movement. This process, the stabilization sequence, took 3.2 seconds. During those 3.2 seconds, the bombsight was useless. The crosshairs would drift. The calculations would be wrong. If you dropped during stabilization, you'd miss by hundreds of feet. But if you waited for stabilization to complete, you'd be dead. Japanese gunners needed 2.1 seconds. American bombardiers needed 3.2 seconds. The math didn't work. It couldn't work. And yet on June 4, 1942, Wade McClusky was about to make it work. Wade McClusky wasn't supposed to be leading this attack. He was Air Group Commander on the USS Enterprise, primarily an administrative role. He was supposed to coordinate the attack from the ready room, not fly in it. But on the morning of June 4, 1942, the squadron commander who was supposed to lead the dive bombers was sick with food poisoning. McClusky volunteered to take his place. Nobody thought twice about it. Air Group commanders had flown combat missions before. It was unusual, but it wasn't unheard of. What was unusual was what McClusky did during the 2-hour flight from Enterprise to the Japanese fleet. He thought about the Norden bombsight. He thought about the 3.2-second stabilization delay. He thought about Japanese anti-aircraft doctrine and their 2.1-second engagement time. And then he thought about something else. What if the 3.2-second delay wasn't a problem to overcome? What if it was a timing mechanism to exploit? Japanese gunners were trained to fire at the projected position based on standard American dive profiles. But what if you didn't follow the standard profile? What if you used the 3.2 seconds of bombsight stabilization delay to deliberately slow your dive? The Japanese would aim at where a fast-diving bomber should be, but you wouldn't be there. You'd be behind, still diving, giving your bombsight time to stabilize. The Japanese would fire at empty sky. By the time they realized their mistake and adjusted, your bombsight would be stabilized. You could drop accurately and pull out before they could engage again. It was brilliant. It was mathematically sound. It exploited both the Norden's limitation and the Japanese doctrine's predictability, but it required perfect execution and nerves of steel. McClusky began his dive. Standard procedure, nose down, 70 degrees, speed building toward 250 knots. Japanese gunners on Akagi spotted him immediately. They tracked him. They calculated his trajectory based on standard American profiles. They aimed at the predicted intercept point. And then McClusky did something unexpected. He reduced throttle, not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to slow his dive speed from 250 knots to 188 knots. This did two things. First, it gave his Norden bombsight the full 3.2 seconds it needed to stabilize. His crosshairs steadied, his targeting solution locked in. Second, it meant he wasn't where the Japanese gunners expected him to be. They fired at the projected position for a 250-knot dive. McClusky was 300 feet behind that position. Still diving, bombsight now stable, target locked in his crosshairs. The Japanese gunners realized their error. They tried to adjust, but by the time they could re-aim, McClusky's bombsight released his 1,000-pound bomb automatically. The bomb fell for 6 seconds. Perfect ballistic curve, perfectly calculated by the now stabilized Norden bombsight. It struck the Akagi's forward elevator, penetrated the flight deck, and detonated in the hangar bay, where dozens of fully fueled and armed aircraft were staged for the next strike wave. The explosion triggered a chain reaction. Fuel fires spread, ammunition cooked off. Within 30 seconds, Akagi was a floating inferno. McClusky pulled out of his dive. Standard recovery procedure, but he'd done something extraordinary. He'd survived the 3-second window, and he'd hit his target. Behind him, 32 other dive bombers followed McClusky's lead. They all slowed their dives. They all gave their bomb sights the stabilization time. They all survived the approach, and they all hit their targets. In 6 minutes, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were crippled or sinking. The Battle of Midway was effectively over. Japan would never recover its carrier-striking power, and it all came down to Wade McClusky, understanding those 3 seconds better than anyone else. But here's what's remarkable. McClusky never reported his tactic officially. He didn't write it up. He didn't submit it through channels. He just told his pilots, "Do what I did." The tactic spread through the Pacific Fleet by word of mouth. Pilot to pilot, squadron to squadron. Slow your dive. Give the bombsight time. Make the Japanese gunners miss. By August 1942, most American dive bomber pilots in the Pacific were using the hesitation dive, not because headquarters ordered it, because it worked, because it kept them alive. Navy headquarters didn't officially learn about the tactic until September 1942, 3 months after Midway. An intelligence officer named Commander John Murray was interviewing Enterprise pilots for after-action reports. He kept hearing the same thing: "We slowed down during the dive." Murray was confused. Slowing down during a dive violated every doctrine. It took him 2 weeks of interviews and tactical analysis to understand what McClusky had figured out in 2 hours. The 3-second delay wasn't the limitation. It was a weapon. Murray asked why McClusky hadn't reported this in his after-action analysis. McClusky's response was blunt: "Because it violates doctrine. If I'd reported it officially, my pilots would have been disciplined for not following procedure. Better to win the battle and keep quiet than to win the battle and lose my squadron to paperwork." Murray understood, but he also understood that this tactic needed to be formalized, tested, distributed to other squadrons. He wrote a classified technical report titled "Controlled Deceleration Diving: Exploiting Bombsight Stabilization Delay for Anti-Aircraft Avoidance." The report was 47 pages long. It included mathematical proofs, ballistics calculations, and recommendations for updated tactical doctrine. On September 18, 1942, the report was approved by the Bureau of Ordnance. On October 3, 1942, it became official U.S. Navy doctrine. They called it the Midway Profile. In early 1943, Navy engineers did what engineers do. They tried to fix the Norden bombsight. If the 3.2-second stabilization delay was being deliberately exploited as a tactical timing mechanism, then surely a shorter delay would be even better, right? Engineers redesigned the hydraulic damping system. They increased fluid pressure, modified cylinder dimensions, and upgraded the gyroscope bearings. The result was the Norden Mark 15 bombsight with a stabilization time of only 1.8 seconds. The Mark 15E entered service in March 1943. It was installed on all new dive bombers. It was supposed to be an upgrade. It was a disaster. Pilots had spent 6 months training with the 3.2-second timing. Their muscle memory was calibrated to count 1001, 1002, 1003. Their hesitation dive rhythm was built around that specific duration. When the delay shortened to 1.8 seconds, pilots' timing was wrong. They would hesitate for 3.2 seconds, their trained rhythm, but the bombsight would stabilize after only 1.8 seconds. For the remaining 1.4 seconds, the aircraft would be moving past the optimal release point. Hit rates actually decreased with the improved bombsight. By July 1943, experienced dive bomber squadrons were requesting the older Mark 15 bombsights. Supply officers thought it was a mistake. Why would anyone want obsolete equipment? But the requests kept coming. Enterprise, Hornet, Saratoga, all the carriers with veteran dive bomber squadrons specifically requested Mark 15 bombsights. The Navy never officially acknowledged why, but supply records show that Mark 15 bombsights remained in frontline service through 1944 long after they were supposed to be phased out. The lesson was clear but uncomfortable. Sometimes an engineering improvement makes things worse. Sometimes the flaw is the feature. This principle that delays and limitations can be tactical advantages is now taught at every naval aviation school. It's in the fighter pilot training curriculum. It's in aerospace engineering textbooks. But it started with Wade McClusky counting to 3 while people shot at him. We should talk about Tadashi Nakajima. Remember him? The 19-year-old Japanese gunner who fired at McClusky and missed? Nakajima survived the sinking of Akagi. He was one of 221 sailors rescued from a crew of 1,630. After the war in 1947, Nakajima was interviewed by American naval historians researching the Battle of Midway. He was asked about the American dive bomber attack. Nakajima said something that the historians almost dismissed. The American bombers changed speed during their dive. We were trained to fire at the projected position, but the projection was wrong. They were not where they should have been. The historians included this observation in their report, but they didn't understand its significance. It would be another 15 years before McClusky's hesitation dive tactic was declassified and publicly acknowledged. When Nakajima learned in 1962 that the American bombers had deliberately slowed down to exploit his training doctrine, he reportedly said, "I knew the Americans were clever. I did not know we were predictable." Tadashi Nakajima died in 1998 at age 75. In his later years, he taught engineering at Tokyo University. One of his courses was titled The Danger of Optimizing for Expected Conditions. Wade McClusky survived the war. He retired from the Navy in 1956 as a Rear Admiral. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway, the Navy's second highest decoration for valor. The citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism and outstanding tactical leadership. It did not mention the hesitation dive. It did not mention the 3.2-second timing exploitation. That information was still classified. McClusky rarely spoke about Midway in his later years. When asked about the battle in interviews, he would deflect credit to his pilots, his crew chiefs, his intelligence officers. But in 1974, 2 years before his death, McClusky gave an interview to a Navy historian. The interview was not published until 1987. In that interview, McClusky said something remarkable. "People ask me how I had the courage to slow down during the dive while the Japanese were shooting at me. They think it was bravery. It wasn't. It was mathematics. I had calculated that slowing down would actually reduce my risk, not increase it. The 3 seconds of hesitation gave Japanese gunners time to aim at where I wasn't. Courage is doing something dangerous despite the fear. What I did was reduce the danger by understanding the engineering better than anyone else." Wade McClusky died in 1976 at age 76. His obituary in the New York Times mentioned Midway. It mentioned his Navy Cross. It mentioned that he had sunk 2 carriers. It did not mention that he had figured out how to turn a 3-second engineering delay into a weapon, because sometimes the most important victories are the ones that remain invisible On June 4, 1942, Wade McClusky had 3 seconds to choose between accuracy and survival. He chose both, because he understood that the choice was based on false assumptions. The Norden bombsight's 3.2-second stabilization delay was not a weakness. It was not a flaw to overcome. It was a timing mechanism that could be exploited against an enemy who relied on predictable patterns. McClusky's hesitation dive tactic sank 4 Japanese carriers. It killed 3,057 Japanese sailors. It changed the trajectory of the Pacific War, and it all came down to understanding those 3 seconds better than anyone else. The lesson isn't about dive bombing or hydraulic systems or War II naval tactics. The lesson is this: sometimes the limitation you're trying to overcome is actually the advantage you should be exploiting. Carl Norden tried to build a perfect bombsight. What he actually built was a 3-second timing delay. Wade McClusky understood that the delay was the weapon, and in those 3 seconds, he won the Battle of Midway. If you want to learn more about the engineering decisions that changed World War II, the tiny details that made massive differences, check out our next video about how British tank crews figured out how to make tea at 30 miles per hour. It sounds ridiculous. It saved 47 lives. The engineering reason why will surprise you. Hit subscribe. We post new military engineering stories every 2 days at 10 a.m. Pakistan time. And if you found this story valuable, leave a comment. What would you have done with 3 seconds to choose between accuracy and death? This is Untold Valor. We find the 3-second decisions that changed history.